For my first 20 years building things, I believed the answer to better work was one more machine. I had a whole wall of them. A planer, a jointer, a table saw that cost more than my first car. Then a garden gate I glued up with the best waterproof adhesive on the shelf, cracked clean along its glue line in the second winter. And I stood in the cold, feeling like a fraud. That was the day an old boat builder told me something I refused to believe. The Vikings, he said, built ships that crossed an ocean with almost nothing but an axe. I want to be honest with you. I laughed at him. I was standing in a modern shop surrounded by cast iron and electricity, and here was a man in a leather apron telling me that one blade could do the work of my whole wall. But he had spent 40 years in a heritage yard down on the Essex coast, and when a man like that tells you something, you listen, even when you are sure he is wrong. So I went, and I learned. And what I found humbled me in a way the machines never could. Here is the claim, and I'm going to prove it to you step by step by walking the entire build. A Viking ship, the kind that carried whole families across open water to lands they had never seen, was shaped almost entirely by the axe. Not by a sawmill or a planer, but by a single blade in skilled hands with only a small handful of helpers. By the end of this, you are going to understand a way of working wood that is stronger than most of what we glue and screw together today. Hold on to that, because it leads somewhere that still seems impossible. This story does not start with my failure. It starts with a living oak standing in a northern forest that has no idea it is about to become a ship. The first job is to bring the tree down, and the axe does it. A Viking shipwright did not want just any oak. He wanted a tall, straight, slow-grown oak, the kind that fights for light in a dense forest and grows tight, even rings because of it. Slow growth means dense wood, and dense wood means strength. He would walk the woodland and read the trees the way you and I read a tape measure, looking for the shapes he needed before he ever swung a blade. A naturally curved limb was not a flaw to him. It was a finished part of the boat, already grown into the shape he wanted. When he found his oak, the axe went to work. He cut a notch on the side he wanted the tree to fall, then worked from the other side until the trunk gave way and came down with a sound you feel in your chest. I have felled oak by hand, and I will tell you, it is humbling labor. Your shoulders learn the meaning of the word green. The blade bites, the chips fly off the size of your palm, and the whole forest seems to hold its breath when a big oak finally leans and goes down. But most people overlook the real point of it. He was not just dropping a tree. He was choosing his material at the source, matching the grain of the standing trunk to the part of the ship it would become. That kind of judgment is the first secret, and no machine has ever owned it. Once the oak was down, the real magic began, and it is the opposite of everything a modern shop would tell you to do. Today, if you and I want planks from a log, we send it to a sawmill and we cut it. Steel teeth slice straight through the trunk, through the rings, through the grain, however the blade happens to fall. The Vikings did something different, and it changed everything about how their ships behaved on the water. They split the log instead of cutting it. The word for it is reeving. You drive wedges into the end of the trunk and let the wood tear itself apart along its own grain lines, following the fibers exactly the way the tree grew them. Think about what that means. A sawn board cuts across the grain and leaves the fibers severed, open to water and to weakness. A Riven board follows the grain unbroken from one end to the other, so every fiber runs the full length of the plank. That is a stronger board. It is a more flexible board, and because the surface follows the natural structure of the wood, it sheds water instead of soaking it up. Wood is hygroscopic, which is just a long word for the fact that it drinks in and releases moisture like a living thing, all its life. A Riven plank handles that movement gracefully, because you never fought the grain in the first place. And this is not just a history lesson. The same truth governs the gate you hang, the bench you leave out in the weather, the planter box you build for the garden. When you buy a board that was sawn flat across the grain, you are buying severed fibers and a face that wants to drink water. Work with the grain the way the old builders did, and your outdoor pieces will fight rot and movement for decades longer. The Vikings knew it. Somewhere along the way, we forgot it. The axe and the wedge turned one great oak into a stack of thin, tapered boards called strakes. A single good log could yield a surprising number of them, splitting in halves, then quarters, then thin radial wedges, like slicing a pie from the center out. There was almost no sawdust, and none of the dense heart of the tree was thrown away. Just clean, strong boards that came apart, willing instead of forced. The first time I tried it myself, I got greedy. I drove my wedges too fast and too hard, chasing the split, and the plank ran out, which means the grain wandered off course and my board tapered down to nothing halfway along and tore right off the log. Ruined. The old man at the Essex yard did not even look up. He just said the wood will tell you where it wants to go if you stop shouting at it. So I slowed down. I read the grain at the end of the log. I started my wedges along the line the fibers already wanted, and I let the oak open in its own time. The next plank came off clean and true, the full length, and I understood something I had been missing for 3 decades. The wood was never my enemy. My hurry was, trust the wood. That is the whole lesson, and it is the first thing that turns a tree into a boat that can cross an ocean. If that idea grabs you the way it grabbed me, I went and put everything I learned about it into a book called Secrets of the Shipyard. It is 150 pages on Viking and naval carpentry, including how to make wooden joints and tree nails that actually tighten as the years pass, the exact opposite of the joints that keep failing on us. If you want to keep that knowledge on your shelf, scan the QR code on your screen. So we have our strakes, our Riven oak planks, split clean from the log. But a split board is rough and uneven, and a ship needs planks that are smooth, fair, and tapered to fit a curving hull. This is the job we would now hand to a planer and a jointer, 2 of the most expensive machines on my old wall. The Viking Shipwright did it with a single long-bladed axe. The tool is the broad axe, sometimes called a side axe, and it is a beautiful thing. The blade is wide and flat, sharpened on one side only, so it can shave along the face of a board like a chisel the size of your forearm. The shipwright would stand the plank up, or lay it across a low support, and with short, controlled strokes, he would slice off thin shavings, working the rough riven surface down to something flat and clean. Where the plank needed to grow thinner toward the ends, he simply took more, tapering the board by eye and by feel. I want you to stay with that for a moment, by eye and by feel. He had no fence to set, no depth stop, nothing to read off a screen, only a blade, and 30 or 40 years of his hands, knowing exactly how the wood would peel. The best of them could hew a plank so flat and so even that you would swear it came off a machine. And the surface an axe leaves behind, slightly faceted, slightly burnished, actually holds up to weather better than a sanded one, because the blade compresses the fibers instead of tearing them open. That is your planer. That is your jointer, both replaced by a single blade swung well. Now we come to the part that separates a craftsman from a master. The ends of a Viking ship are not flat. They sweep up in those long, graceful curves you picture when you think of a longship, the prow rising out of the water like the neck of an animal. Those sweeping ends are called the stems, and carving them is some of the hardest axe work in the whole build. Remember the curved oak limbs the shipwright chose back in the forest? This is where they earn their place. Rather than bending a straight board and fighting its memory forever, he found a branch or a root that had already grown in roughly the curve he needed, so the grain ran around the bend, unbroken and strong. Then he took up the axe again and carved the stem to its final sweeping shape, following the grain through the curve, cutting away everything that was not the boat. It is patient, deliberate work, the kind where one careless swing can ruin a timber he spent a whole day searching the forest to find. So he goes slowly, reading the grain ahead of the blade, letting the curve reveal itself. A bent board always wants to spring back. It carries the memory of being forced, and over years on the water, it works against every fastening you trust to hold it. But a stem carved from naturally curved timber has no fight left in it. It was born in that shape. It will hold that shape longer than you and me both, as the old man liked to say. And that single decision, to grow your curves instead of bending them, is one of the reasons these boats lasted on the brutal water they were built for. Now, I have been telling you the axe did almost everything, and that is true. But it was not entirely alone. A master works with a small, tight kit, and the rest of the Viking tool set is worth meeting. because every piece earned its keep. First, the adze. An adze looks like an axe whose blade has been turned sideways, so it cuts toward you in scooping strokes, perfect for hollowing. Where the inside of a plank or a timber needed to be dished out and shaped, the adze did the carving the broadaxe could not reach. Watch an experienced hand with an adze, and it looks almost careless, the blade swinging right past the boots, peeling out curls of oak with every stroke. It is not careless. It is control you cannot fake. Second, the auger. Once the overlapping planks were ready to be joined, somebody had to bore the holes for the fastenings, and that job fell to a hand auger, often a breast auger, that the shipwright leaned his whole chest into, turning it by hand to drill clean holes through the oak. Through those holes went iron rivets, hammered over small washers, called roves on the inside, locking the overlapping planks tight. That overlapping style, where each plank laps over the one below it, like the clapboards on a house, is called clinker building, and it is what let these hulls flex instead of break. The planks were only half the story. Inside the hull, the shipwright fixed the frames and ribs to the planking with wooden pegs called tree nails, or trunnels, if you grew up in a yard like I did. A trunnel is simply a turned oak dowel driven tight into a bored hole, and here lies the quiet genius of it. Wood swells when it meets moisture. So the moment that oak peg took on the damp of the sea, it expanded inside its hole and locked itself in place, growing tighter with every voyage, instead of working loose the way a steel screw backs out over a few hard winters. The boat fastened itself together more securely the longer it stayed at sea. And there is a detail in this that you rarely hear anyone mention. The Vikings often did not seal those joints with anything we would call glue. They laid tarred wool or animal hair into the lap between the planks, a watertight seam we call the faying surface, so the boards themselves pressed the seal tight as the hull worked in the waves. The harder the sea squeezed, the better it sealed. Axe, adze, auger, wedge, and a knife or two. That was the whole shop. So picture the full ratio of what we are talking about. A handful of hand tools you could carry in a single bag, swung by men who had given their lives to learning them, producing a vessel light enough to be dragged up onto a beach by its own crew, and strong enough to survive the open North Atlantic. Stay with how absurd that is. The North Atlantic is one of the cruelest stretches of water on this earth, and they crossed it in open wooden boats shaped by an axe. There was no cabin to shelter in and no engine to outrun a storm, only the boat, a single square sail, and the open sea. And they did not just cross it once. The Norse sailed these ships to Iceland, then onward to Greenland, and eventually all the way to the coast of North America, 500 years before Columbus, in hulls that had no engine, no steel frame, nothing but riven oak and iron rivets and skill. The clinker hull let the whole boat flex and twist with the swell instead of fighting it, like a basket riding the water, rather than a rigid box getting hammered by it. That flexibility, born from riven planks and overlapping strakes, is exactly why they survived seas that would have cracked a stiffer ship in half. If you doubt any of this, history handed us a test. In 1893, a crew built a full-size copy of one of these ships, the famous Gokstad ship that had been pulled from a Norwegian burial mound, and they sailed it across the Atlantic, from Norway all the way to America, just to prove it could be done. It held together beautifully in heavy weather. A design more than 1,000 years old, shaped by the same simple tools, crossed the ocean again. That is the payoff I promised you. That is what an axe in a master's hands was capable of. I find that almost impossible to hold in my head even now. A boat with no nails clamping its planks together, sealed with nothing but tar and wool, built entirely by hands and never by motors, riding out the same ocean that has swallowed steel ships whole. That is not luck. That is mastery, handed down and practiced until it became second nature. Now, let me take you back to my shop and that wall of machines I was so proud of. A planer to flatten a board, a jointer to true an edge, a bandsaw to cut a curve, a sander to smooth a face. Thousands of dollars and a dozen power cords and a room full of noise. All of it doing work that one man once did with a single blade and a lifetime of practice. I am not telling you to throw your tools out. I use mine every day, and I am grateful for them. But I think we have forgotten something, and it is worth saying plainly. We did not get better than the old builders. We got more equipment. We bought our way around skill instead of earning it. And somewhere in that trade, we lost the kind of judgment that let a man look at a standing oak and see a finished ship waiting inside it. The Vikings did not have less than us. In the ways that truly matter to wood, they may have had more. So here is what I want you to carry out of this. The same thing I carried out of that Essex yard years ago, the day I stopped trusting my wall and started trusting my hands. It was never about the number of tools. A man with one axe and 40 years of mastery will build something that outlasts a man with a $40,000 shop and no patience. The tool does not make the work. The hands that swing it do. I still think about that cracked garden gate sometimes, the one that broke along its glue line and started all of this. I built it with the best machines money could buy, and it failed me in 2 winters. The Vikings built boats with an axe, and some of them are still being lifted, whole and solid, out of the ground 1,000 years later. The difference was never the equipment. The difference was knowing the wood and respecting what it can do when you finally stop fighting it. If you want to build things that outlast you, without modern glue or screws, that is exactly what my book, Secrets of the Shipyard, is for. 16 chapters and 3 full build projects, along with the old preservation methods of pitch, tallow, tar, and linseed oil that kept these hulls alive for generations. The link is in the description. And if you want more of this ocean-tested, centuries-lasting kind of woodworking, subscribe to the Master Shipwright and build alongside me.